Dear learners, today let us examine Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, The Remains of the Day. Kazuo Ishiguro is a contemporary British author who is renowned for his novels as well as his songs. The Remains of the Day, which was published in 1989, is one of his most prominent works. The novel deals with the lives of the members of the British servile class, which is employed in the services of the aristocratic class. The novel deals with themes of love, memory, loss, and the perspective of Stevens, who is in love with Miss Kenton. Now, let us examine the life and work of Kazuo Ishiguro. Kazuo Ishiguro, a Japanese-born British writer, was born on 8th of November 1954 in Nagasaki, Japan. He began to live in London, United Kingdom since 1960. He is one of the most widely read of contemporary British writers. Born to a Japanese couple in the city of Nagasaki, Ishiguro moved to England as a 5-year-old boy. He completed his education in England and attended the universities of Kent and East Anglia. His father was a scientist. Ishiguro was a student of Michael Bradbury at the University of East Anglia, from where he obtained a master's degree in creative writing. Ishiguro is one of the most celebrated contemporary fiction writers in England. He was nominated 4 times for the Man Booker Prize. He won the Man Booker Prize in 1989 for his novel, The Remains of the Day. Ishiguro is a prolific writer and has penned several novels, including A Pale View of the Hills, published in 1982, An Artist of the Floating World, published in 1986, The Remains of the Day, published in 1989, The Unconsoled, published in 1995, When We Were Orphans, published in 2000, and Never Let Me Go, published in 2005. His novel, The Buried Jade, is due for publication in 2015. Ishiguro has also penned numerous short stories. Some of his stories have been compiled into collections such as A Family Supper, which was published in 1990, A Village After Dark, published in 2001, and Nocturnes, 5 Stories of Music and Nightfall, which was well received when it was published in 2009. Besides being a novelist, Ishiguro is also a successful screenplay writer and songwriter. He has partnered the artist Stacy and has written numerous songs. Ishiguro is currently one of the most prominent writers to have emerged in England post the Second World War. In a poll conducted by the Times, Ishiguro was one of the few writers of Asian origin to have found a place on the greatest British writers since 1945. The list is a rather prestigious one, and Ishiguro was ranked 32nd on it. The Remains of the Day is one of the most well-known works of Kazuo Ishiguro. It was published in 1989 and was nominated for the Man Booker Prize Award. Ishiguro, who was nominated 4 times for this prestigious literary award, won the prize only for this novel. The novel was successful and was adapted into a film which was directed by James Ivory and was released in 1993. And the film was titled The Remains of the Day. The book deals with the transformation in England's society. It discusses the shift in culture of England's post-Second World War. Post the Second World War, England witnessed massive sociological changes as the old generation was slowly fading out. The conventional aristocracy was being replaced by rich immigrants. The conventional aristocracy employed the services of a retinue of chauffeurs, housekeepers, gamekeepers, butlers, and chefs. These assistants, as a sociologist Thorstein Veblen argued, were viewed as indications of the cultural capital of the aristocrat. In other words, without these assistants, it was very difficult to differentiate the leisured classes from the non-leisured classes. Post the Second World War, many of the aristocratic landlords found it difficult to maintain their estates. Many of these estates were sold away. As the members of the conventional aristocracy, the personal assistants found it difficult to adjust to new masters. However, the aristocracy never allowed their assistants to express themselves freely. The assistants kept their feelings and opinions to themselves. While the idea of a butler might conceive the image of a warm, satirical, and eloquent Woodhousian Jeeves in the mind of the 21st century reader, in reality, the butler had very few chances to speak his mind out. The shift in the economy of England brought in new elite which began to acquire the properties of the older aristocrats. They also had different political ideologies. The loquacious elite owners and the reserved assistants were seldom comfortable with each other. There was a break in the communication as the new generation emerged. The Remains of the Day narrates the story of Stevens, who is employed in the services of Mr. Faraday. Mr. Faraday is a wealthy gentleman who has recently moved to England from America. The story is narrated in first person and uses the technique of flashback to reveal things about the past. Stevens is an experienced butler with many decades of dedicated service on the estate. He has been a loyal attendant of Lord Darlington. The action in the novel begins with Stevens receiving a letter from a former colleague, Miss Kenton. The letter describes her married life. Stevens assumes that Miss Kenton is stuck in an unhappy marriage. The flashback reveals that Stevens had an opportunity to embark on a lifelong relationship with Miss Kenton. He let the opportunity to pass and assumes that he finally has a chance to revive the relationship again. Stevens intends that under the guise of investigating the possibility of re-employing Kenton, he could interact with her. Mr. Faraday lends him his car and encourages him to go on a motoring trip. He says that Stevens has earned the trip well. During the trip, Stevens begins to reflect on his relationship with Lord Darlington. He also reflects on the nature of the term dignity. Stevens introspects the relationship that he had shared with his father. Finally, Stevens thinks about his feelings for Miss Kenton. It is revealed gradually that Kenton and Stevens loved each other without expressing their feelings. Kenton and Stevens worked in Lord Darlington's service in the years leading up to the Second World War. Stevens admires Darlington and is his loyal butler, despite the serious flaws in Lord Darlington's character. Stevens blindly adores him. Stevens and Miss Kenton fail to admit their true feelings to each other. However, the recollected conversations indicate that there is a professional friendship which exists between them, which borders on romance. Neither Stevens nor Kenton dare to profess their love to each other. As the novel goes on, it is revealed that Darlington has left his estate and Mr. Faraday, a wealthy American, has taken over it. Mr. Faraday is not reserved like Lord Darlington, but is an easygoing and a loquacious master. Stevens finds it difficult to adjust with the change. It is also revealed that Miss Kenton has been married for over 20 years now and is currently Mrs. Ben. She has feelings for Stevens and often wonders how her life with Stevens would have turned out to be. Her marriage has resulted in her producing children, and she is currently anticipating the arrival of her first grandchild. It is clear that she still loves her husband. The novel concludes with Stevens reconciling to the fact that there is no chance of him renewing his relationship with Kenton. Instead, he decides to continue to work the remainder of his working years to the best of his ability, serving his new master, Mr. Faraday. The chief character in the novel The Remains of the Day is Stevens. The other characters are Miss Kenton, Lord Darlington, and Mr. Faraday. Mr. Stevens is also the narrator of the story. So let us discuss the character of Stevens. Stevens, the head butler at Darlington Hall, is the protagonist and the narrator of the novel. He is a precise man and is worried about living a life of dignity. He always denies his feelings throughout the novel. He misunderstands the idea of dignity and always assumes a mask of professional poise. He never reveals his true feelings. He absolutely trusts and adores Lord Darlington, who is not a practical man himself. He believes that Darlington was doing noble things all the time. However, Stevens is regretful that he has not cultivated intimate relationships with others. Stevens is influenced by his father and speaks of him as an extraordinary butler. Stevens assumes that he should be as formal as his father, and such formality limits his personal growth and his relationships. Dear learners, let us now examine the characters of Miss Kenton, Lord Darlington, and Mr. Faraday. Miss Kenton is the former head housekeeper of the Darlington Hall. She was a contemporary of Stevens' father, as they were hired at the same time. However, she has also worked long years with Stevens. Miss Kenton is a capable and an efficient woman whose work matches that of Stevens. She also additionally possesses a warmth and pleasing personality that Stevens never displayed. When Miss Kenton first starts working at Darlington Hall, she brings flowers into Stevens' austere room to brighten it up. She tries to introduce changes, which Stevens immediately rejects. Kenton and Stevens disagree over household affairs, and such encounters gradually seem to build affection between them. But as time goes on, there is no progress in the level of the relationship. Stevens never tries to reveal his true feelings, and he always hides it under the guise of poise. Miss Kenton grows tired of her colleagues' nagging and does not want to foster any personal feelings for Stevens. She leaves Darlington Hall finally and marries Mr. Ben. Miss Kenton, unlike Stevens, is independent and does not buy Lord Darlington's values. She thinks for herself and bases her actions on her own thoughts and beliefs. She has more dignity and personal integrity than Stevens has. She chooses to live the life as she pleases. Towards the end of the novel, it is revealed that her life is more meaningful and complete. She occasionally wonders what could have been her life had she settled down with Stevens. However, she is quite content with Mr. Burns and is currently awaiting the arrival of her first grandchild. Lord Darlington is the former owner of the Darlington Hall. He dies 3 years before the action in the novel begins. Darlington is an old-fashioned English gentleman who has a soft corner for the Nazis. He regrets the harshness with which England treated Germany post the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. One of his German friends committed suicide after the Great War. Darlington feels guilty for what England has done to Germany. He believes that England had humiliated the Germans. Darlington is politically conscious and organizes political meetings in his house. Darlington is well endowed and is well connected. He even houses the political heads of England and Germany to discuss and resolve the conflict between both the countries. He tries his best to avert the Second World War but fails in his attempts. Lord Darlington is an impractical man. He does not understand the hidden agenda of the Nazis. He allows himself to be used by the Nazis. His sympathies for the Nazis brings him bad reputation in Britain. Post Second World War, Darlington is labeled a Nazi sympathizer and a traitor, which ruins his reputation further. It leaves him a broken and disillusioned man at his death. Lord Darlington, for reasons best known to him, goes with the Nazis. He openly sides and openly states his sympathies for the Germans. He thinks that it is dignified of him to avert the Second World War. Stephen always speaks highly of Darlington throughout the novel. He says it is a shame that people come to have such a terribly mistaken view of such a noble man. It is very clear that Stevens does not see Lord Darlington for what he is. He builds an image of Darlington which is much larger than the actual man himself. On the other hand, Mr. Faraday is a wealthy American who has bought the estate of Lord Darlington. He is unused to the stiff upper lip lifestyle that the gentry of England practiced. His behavior and his outlook are very different from that of Lord Darlington. He attempts to be friendly with the staff and attempts to win their confidence. He chats a lot with his staff and tries his best to make them feel comfortable. He resembles change in the story and is able to understand the members of his staff. However, he is unable to understand Stevens, who has a different understanding of life, including dignity. In recognition of Stevens' services, Faraday lends him his car and grants him permission to take a well-deserved week's break from work. He also lends his motor car to Stevens, an act which Lord Darlington would never have done. The first theme that recurs all through the work is dignity and greatness. The compound qualities of dignity and greatness are discussed many times in Stevens' thoughts. Stevens thinks about these qualities throughout the novel. Stevens elaborates on the qualities that constitute a butler, a great butler. He states that dignity is quintessential to greatness. He illustrates the concept with a number of examples, finally concluding that dignity has to do crucially with a butler's ability not to abandon the professional being he inhabits. Stevens develops this exclusively professional mindset only too well, because he always dons the mask of an imperturbable butler. He necessarily denies and therefore leaves unexpressed his own personal feelings and beliefs. Stevens' pursuit of dignity in his professional life completely takes over his personal life as well. By suppressing his individuality in this manner, Stevens never achieves true intimacy with another person. The fact that his view of dignity is so misguided is sad. However, we can tell that Stevens has always wanted great things, but he chose the wrong way of attaining them. Now, let us examine the second theme of regret. Although Stevens never overtly discusses what he thinks regret may mean, it becomes clear when he breaks down and cries at the end of the novel that he wishes he had acted differently with regard to Miss Kenton and Lord Darlington. The tone of the novel is often wistful or nostalgic for the past. As the story goes on, the tone deepens into one of regret as Stevens re-evaluates his past actions and decisions and finds them unwise. Miss Kenton also openly says at the end of the novel that she often regrets her choices that she has made in her life. The overwhelming sadness of the ending is only slightly lifted by Stevens' resolve to perfect the art of bantering. It seems a meager consolation considering the irreparable losses that he has experienced in his life. Now, let us examine the third theme of loss. Literal and figurative loss abounds for almost every character in the remains of the day. Stevens loses his father, Miss Kenton, and eventually his hope of Miss Kenton to return to Darlington Hall. He has also lost Lord Darlington, in whom is invested his manhood. Miss Kenton loses her aunt, her only relative, and loses Stevens when she leaves him to marry a man she does not love. Lord Darlington loses two friends, Herr Bremen, the German friend who commits suicide, and Sir David Cardinal. He also loses his grandson, Reginald Cardinal, when they die. Furthermore, Darlington loses his reputation and to some degree his own sanity. He also is forced to leave his estate. Reginald Cardinal loses his father to death and his godfather, Lord Darlington, to Nazis' brainwashing. There are both literal and figurative deaths, deaths of loved ones and figurative deaths of dreams, ideals, reputations, and lives. Dear learners, now let us examine the other motifs. Bantering. Towards the end of the novel, Stevens makes a resolve to practice bantering. Through his growing up years and his adult life, Stevens has practiced the art of bottling himself up. He has never spoken his mind, nor has he ever revealed his opinions. He blindly follows his father and takes him up for his role model. Despite knowing the fact that his father is 20 years his senior and that the world has changed around him, the ideal butler for Stevens remains the father. Stevens assumes that his father is the image that he has to live up to. Hence, he was always forced to play a stiff upper-lipped butler. This has led Stevens to cultivate no human relationships. By the end of the novel, Stevens realizes that he has practically no relationship with any human being. Hence, he decides to practice bantering. He realizes the importance of bantering or talking easy things with his staff. He realizes that bantering is very important only towards the end of the novel and resolves that he would chat up with his employer, Mr. Faraday. The second motif in the novel, English landscape. The landscape that is picturized in the early decades of 20th century is very different from the landscape that is portrayed as the action in the novel begins. Unlike in the early decades of the 20th century, Mr. Faraday owns a motor car. Mr. Faraday gives away his motor car instead of a carriage to Mr. Stevens. And Mr. Stevens, who initially thought of going on a hiking trip, agrees to undertake a motoring trip. The last motif that we discuss here is that of human relationships. None of the human relationships in the novel are happy. Whether it be the relationship with Lord Darlington or his father or with Miss Kenton, Mr. Stevens has always had a stiff relationship, a rather formal relationship with all his loved ones. This has resulted in stunting the growth of the relationship. Every relationship that is portrayed in the novel is incomplete. Thus, the lack of communication between various members, various characters in the novel renders every human relationship impractical. The only person who is actually a good communicator and thereby fosters healthy human relationship is Mr. Faraday, who is also seen as a vindication of change. Now, finally, the novel seems to have been inspired by the war. Despite Ishiguro arguing that the Second World War has never influenced his writing, he is clearly influenced by the effects of the Great Wars. The fact that the Nazis have a very important role to play in the evolution of the novel vindicates the claim that some of the work of Ishiguro is inspired by the effects of the Great Wars. Dear learners, I hope you enjoyed the lesson The Remains of the Day. I hope you'd be inspired to read the actual novel. Thank you.